Hi everyone, like she said. My name is Sello Mkantjwa and I work for a company called Incentivize. And today we're going to be looking at a real-world application using Vue.JS. And this application that we're going to be looking at is, it's a music streaming application that I wrote about a few months ago as a side project. I'll show you what it looks like. Cool. So this is it right here. The basic premise or the idea behind this is you can upload your music from your computer. And then, so for example, if we were to do that, it usually works. But so the idea is that you can upload your music from your computer and then you can access it from anywhere, from any of your other devices. And let's just cancel that. And any music that you upload will show up on this screen. And then when it works, you will be able to play it. You'll be able to play it like a normal player. You guys have seen a player before, right? Cool. So we're going to be using this as a way to introduce some concepts, some of the more common Vue.js concepts. And hopefully we'll also be looking at some code for this stuff. So hopefully you guys will enjoy that. Cool. So the concept that we're going to be looking at are components. This should be familiar to most people. Most front-end frameworks these days are based on components, so your Angular, React. So if you used any of those frameworks, you'll recognize components. We're also going to talk about Vue-router, which is the official routing library for Vue. And then we're also going to look at Vuex, which is your data store or your central state management. Right, components. I mean, there's a lot going on this screen. If you look at the screenshot, there's a lot going on here, but you can probably already see where the components are on the screen. So for example, if you look at there on the left, you have that sidebar. So that's a component right there. And then you have a list of tracks here, each of which is a component on its own. And then any takers for where the other components are? Can you guys see any? That's right. So the little player at the bottom there is also a component. And actually within that, there's another little component there. That seek bar is a component on its own. These controls here are sort of like a subcomponent of the actual play itself. On the left there as well, the current track that's playing, that's also a component. So I mean, we have this holistic app made up of all these little subcomponents. And the reason why you might want to sort of structure your application like this is, I think it is easier to work on or to sort of work on a player component than it is to work on a player portion of a whole app. And what I mean by that is if you're working on a component, then you can concentrate solely on that component on its own. So you can drown out all the noise of what's going on, all the other things that are going on around the app and focus solely on that component. And once that works and you have the confidence that that works, then you can go on and work on all the other components of your application. So I'm going to take a look at, we're going to look at some code now. And the code that I want to look at is for that little component at the bottom, that little player down there. And the reason I chose this component is because there's so many things happening in there. We'll be able to cover a lot of ground. We'll be able to talk about a lot of things just by looking at that component. Okay, cool. And the first thing you'll notice with Vue components is everything is in this component, right? So, I mean, you have your template there. All of your HTML is in this component, right? And then you also have your sort of your business logic right there. You have your JavaScript also in this component. And then if you go down a little bit more, you also have your styles defined in the same component. And that might look a bit weird for some people. It was definitely a bit weird for me when I first encountered it. But as you build more and more components using this style, it sort of makes sense. Mainly because you don't have to keep jumping out of in between files. So you don't have to jump into your JavaScript files and then your CSS. This sort of, it becomes natural and it just makes sense. And if we look at that, our template there at the top, this is sort of the structure of the component from a visual point of view. And if you look at it, it's mostly just normal HTML, a bunch of divs just flying around, except perhaps for these little custom tags here. So we have one here that says current track. That's not a standard HTML tag. There's player controls there as well. There's also a seek bar there. Does anybody know what those are? Those are components. So these are sub-components that are used as sort of building blocks for this player component, right? And if you go down a little bit, you will see here we have, in the JavaScript portion, this is sort of the meat or the logic of this component. And the way you would define or declare a component is you would export a simple JSON object with a few properties. One of those is the name, which is actually optional. So when you define your component, you don't have to give it a name, but it's usually a good idea to give it a name so that when you're debugging, you can see straight off the bat, as soon as you see that message, you can see which component is throwing this, is throwing that your exception. We also have props here. Has anybody heard of props before? Props, so it's a common concept in most of these frameworks, React, for example. And what props are parameters that you can pass in from the parent into this component so that you can initialize it. So for example, here we have a track prop, so which means that this component is not responsible for going out and getting the track that we're supposed to be playing. Instead, the parent that's sort of defining this component will pass the track into that component. Then we have methods. You can also define methods on your component, and these methods are any functions that you want to expose on your template. So for example, here we have a toggle loop method, and all that does is, if we look at the screen and we take a look at these buttons here. So all this does is it let us know, are we in looping mode or are we not in looping mode? So all that means is, at the end of the last song, do we start again from the beginning, or do we just stop playing? And then there's another one here. It's shuffling. Sorry. There's another one here, another method that we expose to the template. Any methods that are not, even if you have functions in your component, any methods that are not part of that methods property will not be visible on your template. And then you can also specify any subcomponents, so the building blocks. If you have any components that form the building blocks of this particular component, you can list them there. So these are the components that we spoke about earlier. So for example, here you have your current track, you have your player controls, and you have your seek bar. These components are the ones that are used here. One thing you might notice is it's kebab case there, Pascal case here. Oh, but that's fine. That translation is done automatically for you, and I think it looks a lot cleaner when it's in that case. Cool. And then also you can define what are called watches on your state. So what that means is, if a particular property or variable on your state changes, you can be notified of those changes and then react according to those changes. So for example, here we have we've defined a watcher on the track, which is, remember, this is a prop that's coming in from the parent, so that could change at any time. So we want to know when that changes, let us know, and then what we do here is we take that new track and then we commit it to our central store. So now that track is, every component that's looking for the current track that's playing is going to retrieve this track that we've just committed here. Cool. And then also you can have your computer properties, which I think the easiest way to understand this is, if you have a component, for example, that takes in two props, A and B, and then it displays the sum of those. So A and B would be your props, and then you can have a computed property, C, which is the sum of those two props. Cool. So these are some of the basic sort of properties that you can have on your component. And there's a lot more that we're not going to go into. For example, there's hooks on your component. I don't know if you guys have in other frameworks, if those are, yeah, exactly. So during the life cycle of your component, certain events get fired. So when it's created, for example, there's an event to say this thing has been created. When it's mounted onto the DOM, there's an event to say it's been mounted. So you can sort of hook into those hooks. And then at any point when one of those events are fired, you can do, you can execute some arbitrary code. For example, had we decided not to pass in a prop into our component and decided to go and fetch the track ourselves to play, then we might say, once this component is created, then go out to some service and get that track loaded, and then we can play it. Cool. And then a little bit below that is the actual styles for this component. And I think the most noteworthy thing here to note or to mention is that these styles defined here are only available or visible to this component. So that's really good, because these, if you have any sort of CSS properties or CSS classes defined on your global scope, or sorry, on your global styles, these are not going to interfere with that. So these are not going to override that. This is not particularly a Vue.JS thing, but I think it's pretty cool. It works straight out of the box like that. Okay, cool. So that's an example of a component. Are there any questions so far? Yes.
Is it possible to actually extract like the script CSS to separate files?
Sorry?
Can you actually extract the script and the CSS to separate files?
Yes, you can. So yeah. Yes. Which is what I did, incidentally, when I started out. So what I did is I had my HTML in my Vue file, and then you'd have your JavaScript in a separate file. So I mean, that's simple. In my case, or in this case, I'm using Webpack. So I mean, I can import that CSS simply. So I can just do a require on the CSS or a require on the JavaScript. So I mean, it is an option. But once you start writing components, you will eventually end up doing it like this. Cool. There's another question that side.
The style, so you talked about how style.
That would be right here.
Style applies to Spotify.
That's right. Yes.
Is that what's meant by scope?
Yes. So I don't know. This is not a specific Vue.js feature. It's a CSS feature. So you can have scoped CSS styles. So this just leverages off of that. Yes, that's fine. So what you can do, in fact, if you check there, there's a few imports. Yeah, so you can import your styles into this component, as I did there. Cool. Any more? All right, cool. So that's it for components. The next thing that we're going to look at is, if I can just check my, yes, the next thing we're going to look at is the Vue-router. And this is going to be a really short section. But basically what the Vue-router is, it allows you to define what happens when you hit a particular route. So for example, if we land on the home page, what component must be loaded? Or what must happen as soon as we hit that route? And Vue has, you'll find that Vue has, unlike React, I don't know, but when I started working with React, I found that a lot of the other things you'd have to go out and find on your own. So if you needed a router, you had to make a decision about which one do I use. You could use like any arbitrary one. If you needed state management, you'd go out and pick anyone that you want. There weren't any, so you weren't necessarily forced, or there weren't any recommended ones. What Vue does, it has official plugins or libraries that they recommend that you use. And these are mostly developed by the core team as well. Cool. Now, if we take a look at, just want to show you what a standard router will look like. It's very simple. So the one thing about a router is that it's an extension of Vue. So it's sort of like a plugin that you have to install, and you do that by using Vue.use router. So now, once you've done that, then you can use that in any of your components as well. And the way to define a router, which is basically all of the routes that are available on your app, is you initialize a new router, and you give it an array of all of the routes that will be available in your app. So for example, here we have the home root. So just give it a path. So when we hit home, this is the component that will be loaded. And you'll see that that home component we get from right here. So we import that component. And then once we hit the home root, that is loaded. You don't really need to give it a name, but once again, it's recommended because it's very easy for debugging. And also sometimes it's much easier to navigate to a route using its name rather than the actual path. And then also, like with components, you can hook into certain events that happen or that are fired when you change from one route to another. So for example, here we have or had a hook to say, before we change from any route to any other route, run this code. And there's a few more that you can hook into if you would like. Cool. Does that make sense? Am I moving? Am I not? Cool. Are there any questions so far? Yes?
Is there any way to handle like dynamic routes, like take like a property listing?
Yes. Right. So you mean, so for example, if we, say for example on the upload route, we wanted to say upload and then a specific track, but that track is like an ID. We give it an ID. Yeah, sure. So you can do that by doing that. So anytime you go to /upload, that last /upload and then /something else, that last piece is a variable or a parameter, and it will be the track. You get what I'm saying? Cool. Any other questions on?
Will that come via the props?
Sorry?
Will that come via the props component?
No. So it comes in. So when you navigate to a route, right, and you load a component on that route, that component has access to, if I can show you real quick, has access to, let's say right here, to a this dot router. So that router is the actual route that you're on, right? Cool. And so all of those, the query string, the path, everything will be listed on that object. Cool. Any other questions there? All right. So the final thing I want to show you is Vuex. This is the central store or the your central state management system, similar to React Redux or actually just Redux. And this is also one of the official libraries provided by Vue. Let's see. Okay. Vue. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find. Yeah. So the Vuex or your store, similar to the Ruta, is a plugin that you have to specifically or explicitly install into Vue. And there we have that line that says Vue.use Vuex. And similar to the Ruta, you would initiate or you would initialize a new store with a JavaScript object and give it a few properties. The first one is the state. So this is almost always on your store. Sorry. And what the state is basically a list of all of the variables that are in your state. So for example, here we have the available tracks. And if you look at, oh, now we're logged out. Sorry, I'll just log in real quick. So if you look at on that home screen, when you land and there's a whole list of tracks that are shown there, that's from our state. So these tracks, they are controlled by that available tracks variable. Similarly, the active track. So you remember we committed the track that's currently playing when we load it onto, or when it changes on our player. So that is the active track. And the way you can change, or the way you should change your state in Vuex is through the use of mutations. So if you think about even a medium-sized app, right? Your state is changing all over the place. I mean, variables, you have 100 components, for example. Your state is all over the place. You don't know what's changing what variables at what time. So what Vuex does is it gives you a place to store all of your shared state for your application. And it also gives you a consistent way to update that state. So now if anything changes, it has to go through this. All right, so you can't just change, you have no access to the actual state. You have to go through one of these mutations to change your state. For example, here we have a mutation to remove a track from the available tracks. If you go back to the app here, there's a little button there. If you click on that, you should probably have like a little thing to say, are you sure you want to delete this? Because what it does, it actually removes it from the database, all references to it, and it removes it from the server. So yeah. So, but when you click on that, eventually, this mutation here will be called. It'll be called, and then all it does is it looks at your state. So all mutations get access to that state property. And all it does is eventually it finds the track that you're trying to remove, and then it removes it from your state. And you saw that once I clicked that button, it was removed from the actual view as well. So that's because everything is in this state, and when this changes, everything changes or updates in the actual app. We have another one here to update the available tracks, which is slightly different from the first one. So when someone logs in onto the app, we have to show them all of the apps that they have available. And what we do is we go down to the server, we pull down all their tracks, and then we persist those tracks using this mutation. All right, cool. So mutations are one way, just one way to mutate or to change your state. Another way is actions. And, okay, so another way to change your state is through the use of actions. The thing with mutations is that they're very simple. All you get is a state parameter. So you get the state and then some parameters that you can use to mutate that state. And you can't do, or you shouldn't do, any asynchronous operations in your mutations. I don't know what happens if you do, but it is very much recommended that you don't. Your actions are very much different, so they're slightly more powerful than your mutations, because when you get in an action, you get what's called a context, which is basically your whole store. And in that context, you have the state, you have access to other actions, you have access to mutations. So within an action, you can call another action, and you can call mutations. You can't do that in your mutations because all you get is the state, right? So now, when I said you click here, right, and it removes the track from the view, it removes it from everywhere. What happens is we actually call this a remove track action. We don't directly call the mutation. This action will eventually call the remove available tracks mutation. And the reason why we put this in here is because we have to do a few things. There's a few things involved in removing an actual track. And one of those is first you remove it from the state, and then you initialize the tracks that are left or the tracks that are available. I mean, your state has changed. The available tracks are different now, all right? So there's a few things happening in the background here that you do in the initialized tracks. So it's not as simple as when you, the play order, for example, of the tracks. There's a few things that are happening, some ugliness happening in there. And so that ugliness is hidden away in another action called initialized tracks. So yeah, actions much more powerful than mutations. You generally use this to do any asynchronous actions and to do more complex operations on your state. If you want to get access to any of your state variables from outside the store itself, you need to define those variables as getters. So for example, we have a getter there for available tracks, and all you get in a getter is a function. You get the state, and then you return something from that state. So these tracks here, for this component, this little track list component, to get those available tracks, it uses that getter to retrieve them from the state. Cool. And then so one final thing with Vuex is, if you can imagine a complex app, right? Say you have a lot of components, 100 components. Now you have each of those components have some sort of variables that they contribute to the state, right? Your state can get pretty big pretty quickly. But there's a way to manage that. What you might want to do is you might want to sort of chunk it into sort of modules that make sense. So for example, here we have a module that deals mostly with player-related things. So for example, if we go in here, this is another Vuex store, but this is sort of like a sub-module for our main store for the app. And this deals with things that are mostly related with the app. So the current track that's playing, is the player playing, the play progress percentage. So those kind of things they might be required by some other components, but they are owned by the player store, all right? So this is a good way to sort of keep your store in check and make sure that it doesn't become overwhelming and too big. Is this the store? Did I delete? Okay, so that's the wrong store. Okay, cool. So, you can see there we have a few other modules. There's one for the player, there's one for the upload component, which is that one. Okay, well, it was there. Okay, so there's one for your upload component as well. We also do a lot of things with auth in the background. There's no explicit component for that, but we have like a separate store that handles all of your authentication related queries or information. So is this user authenticated? What is their user ID? All of that kind of information. Cool. And that's it also for Vuex. And that actually brings me to the end of my talk, just in time. Just in time. So just one more thing. The app that we were looking at you can find it at diddipal.com. You can go take a look at it. I'd appreciate your feedback if you have any. Okay. I'd appreciate your feedback if you have any. And then I'm available on mail. If I close that. Oh, that's interesting. The battery's dead here. It's dead here, but it's still showing there. Okay, anyway, so yeah. So I'm available on mail. My email is giza182@gmail.com. And then you can just search my name, Sello Mkantjwa, on GitHub and Skype. And I also write some stuff on Medium under the name Giza182. Cool. Questions?